Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eve Samples, Executive Director of Friends of the Everglades. Welcome to our Clean Water Conversation today. We've got a great event planned for you. We're going to be dissecting the latest legislative session, breaking down the good, the bad, and the ugly, and sharing some of the unvarnished truth, if you will, about what happened in Tallahassee with the hopes of helping you understand it and keep pace with it. So I want to introduce our guests, but first I'm going to tell you a little bit about these Clean Water Conversations. We started these as a monthly event back during April of 2020 as a method of keeping folks engaged during COVID. And we found them so useful and gotten such great response from those of you who watch and ask questions that we've decided to keep them going on timely topics related to the Everglades, the greater Everglades ecosystem, not just the Southern Everglades. And of course, the most timely topic right now is the recently completed legislative session. It wrapped up on April 30th. So I'm going to introduce our guests. And I also just want to add that we're going to be talking about legislative policy issues, and I want to underscore that Friends of the Everglades will never tell you how to vote. We don't endorse candidates, but we do talk about policy decisions. Sometimes we criticize policy, and we're going to be doing a bit of that today. So I want to underscore that point. So welcome, and we have our fourth guest here, perfect timing, Representative Eskamani. I'm just about to introduce everyone. So I will actually start with you. Anna Eskamani is a member of the Florida House of Representatives from the 47th District in Orange County. Welcome, Representative.
Thank you so much.
I know you're running in and out of the special session today, so we're going to apologize to the audience ahead of time. If you have to step away to vote, we understand. That's what you're elected to do. So just do what you need to do up there, and we look forward to speaking with you. Thanks for making the time today. Next, we have Aliki Moncrief. She is Executive Director of Florida Conservation Voters Education Fund, whose goal it is to engage people in democracy, to protect our environment and healthy communities for everyone. Welcome, Aliki.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great to have you. And finally, last but not least, we have Gil Smart. Gil is a former journalist like myself, and 2 months ago, he joined Friends of the Everglades as our policy director. And this is his debut Clean Water Conversation. So welcome, Gil. We're happy to have you.
Thanks very much for having me, yes.
So Friends of the Everglades released its legislative session report, which Gil did quite a lot of work on this year. We made it public yesterday, and before we dive into Q&A with our guests, I'm just going to give a brief overview of what that looked like, and I'm going to share my screen in order to do that. So Allie Preston is behind the scenes working the channels for Friends of the Everglades. If you can share that, Allie, that would be great. All right. So we focused on 7 issues, and there were many more that we could have talked about, but we tried to boil it down to 7 key issues related to the greater Everglades and clean water issues. So they were the MCORS repeal. MCORS were the toll roads that were approved during the previous legislative session, and in 2019, actually, and were partially repealed this year. We're going to be talking about those a bit. Senate Bill 88, the so-called Right to Farm Bill expansion. Some of these bills are named in misleading ways, and it's important to talk about what they really do, and we'll be discussing that today. Senate Bill 426, this related to preempting seaport regulations, particularly in Key West, where voters approved protections of their seaport to limit cruise ships, the frequency and size. And the legislature came back and preempted those local referendums that passed, and also preempted the ability of other seaports to pass similar limits on size and frequency of cruise ships. Water storage north of Lake Okeechobee, that's a big one. This was a priority of Senate President Wilton Simpson. It relates to aquifer storage and recovery wells that we have concerns about. Everglades oil drilling is always an issue, and we can talk about what did and didn't happen in that regard. And the Blue-Green Algae Task Force Recommendations Bill was another hot topic for us. It went nowhere, but we need to talk about why that is and what needs to be done. And finally, there was a lot of money to spend this year, and I know Gil can talk about that. A lot of that related to the federal stimulus money that came down. So I think a big silver lining of the session was that there was money to spend on preserving land. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Gil. And Gil, maybe you want to kick it off by talking a little bit about the money that poured into the state.
Yeah, and let's. I'll throw this question open to our guests here. On the basis of the federal money, the American Recovery Act funding, Florida spent a ton of money on environmental issues this year. And if I can here, I want to share the Florida Conservation Voters total enviro budget page. Let me see if this will work if I'm able to share my screen. It's not going to work. Maybe if Ali is able to bring that up. Anyway, what it shows is that there was a tremendous surge in spending this year, but a lot of it is one-time spending that, again, comes from this federal funding. The Speaker of the Florida House, Chris Sproul, said this was the greenest budget in Florida's history. I wanted to ask our guests if they agree with that statement. What are your takeaways from the legislative session? What were your top priorities going into the session? How did you fare? How did your issues fare? And we'll start with Rep. Eskamani, who might have to duck out on us here.
And can you hear us okay, Representative?
Thank you so much. And I hope my Wi-Fi is okay. I'm actually on the House floor in what's called the bubble. I hear you great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Sorry. I am on the House floor in the bubble, which is the back room on the House floor. I do apologize for the inconvenience, spotty Wi-Fi. So I think when it comes to spending, when it comes to parts of the budget, thanks to the American Rescue Plan, Florida got an influx of $10 million. We came into
and we are having a hard time hearing you now, Representative.
Money was put back into okay, but I don't know if it's easier to hear me. But I was going to say that when it comes to funding projects, we definitely saw a great deal of investment in Everglades restoration and springs restoration in Florida forever. But policy-wise, it was not a good session, which I know we'll talk about more soon. But we saw a great deal of preemption against energy bills, clean energy bills. And then we also saw, of course, the Right to Farm Act, which many of us call the Right to Harm Act, which actually makes it difficult to stop sugarcane burning. I would argue that when it came to funding, we got money for closing the Piney Point gypsum stack. We got money for some of the manatee crisis where manatees are dying in the River Lagoon. About $8 million allocated towards trying to provide help in that crisis. But honestly, even Florida Forever, we need to put over $1 billion into it to make up for what was cut over the past. So a lot of more work to do.
Okay, thanks. Let's throw it to you, Aliki. Obviously, every organization like Florida Conservation Voters goes into the session with high hopes. Were those high hopes fulfilled?
Well, I appreciate the questions. And as Rep. Eskamani said, I think on the budget front, some of those hopes were fulfilled thanks to the American Rescue Plan. It was a total of $10.3 billion coming to Florida. Just under $2 billion of that was allocated to environmental projects. The two biggest buckets were, number one, this Resilient Florida program, which is going to bring aid to local communities to do vulnerability assessments and to kind of study how can they adapt to climate change. The other big bucket is half a billion dollars for wastewater grant program, which is going to, I think, help. We'll talk, I know, later about some of the water policies, but in terms of helping local communities do septic to sewer conversions and things like that, there are more resources this year. Unfortunately, while the budget was good, it does it, and I know we'll talk about this some more, but it's a one-time deal so far, and it's thanks to the federal government. Really, it's the American Rescue Plan. When it came to, I mean, Rep. Eskamani said it exactly right. When it came to Florida Forever, we were thrilled that it was more than zero, but disappointed because every year since 2015, it's been far less than the historic 300 million a year that we've been expecting. So I know we're going to dig into some of these things in more detail. I would say, thanks to the American Rescue Plan, it was a much better year than we thought it would be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. What a lot of people have pointed out is that, again, if you look at the graphics on the FCV website, you see last year's environmental funding was like this year's funding was like this, but next year, without the federal money, it's going to fall back down to like this. So,
right.
These were not structural changes that allowed for that additional spending. It was a one-time sort of thing. Let's touch base on one of what had been one of our priorities, and it was Senate Bill 88, the Right to Farm, which we kind of call the Right to Harm Act, on the basis of the effect of sugarcane burning. I'll ask Rep. Eskamani this as well, if she's there. Why did this bill pass as handily as it did? Significant folks in the Glades communities who are affected by this. And some of the legislators, you had some very sort of sharp things to say about this. Representative Amari Hardy filed a series of amendments trying to sort of, I guess, soften this bill, if you want to use that term. Yet it passed overwhelmingly. What happened? And was the point of this bill to indemnify the sugar industry from lawsuits over sugarcane burning?
Absolutely. And I really hope folks can hear me for this, because yes, the Right to Farm bill that many of us refer to as the Right to Harm bill, it was 100% backed by the sugar industry. In fact, even the language in the bill was reflective of the case dismissal that the sugar industry, as defendants in a lawsuit, filed in an effort to toss out the case against them when it comes to on communities that experience what folks refer to as black ash, which makes it much harder to not only breathe, but there's more research, dictating long-term health impacts. And so it's sad, because I think part of this bill was just going to expand like agro-tourism into the definition of right to farm, but it seems that it was pursued by big sugar to make it much harder for those who are impacted by not even nuisances, right? Because the Right to Farm bill was originally supposed to be about nuisances. I would argue that this is now about public health. And they added particle emissions, which basically means that if you are a resident that's experiencing particles that can travel upwards of 20 and 25 miles, like we see in the case of sugar, then you can't do anything about it. You have to lean on the Department of Agriculture and their regulations. And unfortunately, we all know that
we lost her again for a moment. And I want to jump in real quickly on the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, because as we've criticized the Right to Farm bill, people have asked us, well, what about FDACs? And absolutely, they have a role to play. They need to strengthen their regulations in terms of sugarcane burning, when it can be permitted. It should not be allowed to continue when winds are blowing toward rural communities that are inland, but not when winds are blowing toward the coast. So anyhow, there's definitely a role for that agency to play. And thanks for those comments, Representative. We heard most of them.
Yeah. Aliki, what's your take on the legislation?
Well said, Eve. Yeah, well said.
We wholeheartedly agree, and we spoke at every opportunity that we could against the right to harm bill. One of the things that we tried to add to the conversation is that it certainly is written as to indemnify or hold harmless the sugar industry for cane burning, but it's broad enough that even water pollution and other harms that people may experience, the door is now closed essentially on their ability to seek remedy in court. One of the egregious things about the bill too is that even if you manage to pass all the hurdles and bring a lawsuit, the remedy that you get is limited to the value of the property
Yes.
that has been damaged, as opposed to, as Rep. Eskamani was pointing out, all the health implications. So terrible bill. We were absolutely against it, and really appreciate Rep. Eskamani's leadership on fighting it, and y'all's as well. You all have been really leading the way on educating the public about sugarcane burning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did highlight it on several occasions. So.
Yeah, and Aliki, more than 1,500 people responded to our request for veto messages to the governor on that within just over 24 hours. It was a big number.
Yeah, that's great.
There was a lot of attention paid to it, and that was one of the interesting things about it, was the fact that there were a lot of people out there who had been following this, who knew what the deal was with this, and yet it passed the House, it passed the legislature pretty handily. And so it was an interesting dynamic how that worked, and not good really for the Glades folks going forward, unfortunately. Let's talk a little bit more. I'll switch gears back to funding here. Talk about the $100 million, Aliki. I'll throw this one to you. Were you pleased to see the $100 million for Florida Forever? I mean, obviously it's not what we'd like to see it, but I guess in Governor DeSantis's original budget, he was talking about half that. And then we get the $300 million for the Florida Wildlife Corridor. Everybody seems really pleased with that. This is great. This is great. So how big of a difference is this going to be? Is this going to make? What happens next year?
So I'll try to keep this brief, because I mentioned earlier, 100 million is certainly better than zero. But what voters intended in 2014 when they passed the Water and Land Conservation Act was to have a steady, stable stream of funding. What we've been doing, the conservation and environmental community, every year we have to go back, essentially to fight for crumbs. And so it's better than zero. And so 100 million this year, holding steady at that number from last year, was welcomed. The $300 million for the Florida Wildlife Corps is really interesting. On the one hand, that's great news. We absolutely support not just the concept of the Florida Wildlife Corridor, but we recognize the importance of wildlife corridors generally. And it's great that we're going to have $300 million, again, thanks to the American Rescue Plan. There are a lot of questions around this, though. For example, will the Florida Forever criteria, which make it so that any land acquisition that the state engages in actually is based on science and is actually based on real data that tells us, yes, this parcel of land is worth protecting for, climate resilience or for aquifer recharge or whatever the reason. So that's a big question mark, is whether, how exactly is this $300 million going to be spent? And then the other big thing, and it's hidden in the fine print language, what do they call that? The Advil print size, the pill bottle language of the bill, is that there's a specific statement that says, if this money is used to purchase a conservation easement, that property owner can still use that easement for mitigation banking, for wetland mitigation banking. And so we can have a whole separate webinar on wetland mitigation banking and whether it's working. So there's I don't want to disparage. It's exciting to see recognition for the wildlife corridor. It's exciting to see some money flowing in that direction, but there are some really significant questions that remain around it.
Yeah, the devils are definitely going to be in the details on this. Rep. Eskamani, can you talk a little bit about that? The Florida Wildlife Corridor, got a lot of attention, and again, everybody's applauding and saying this is a great thing, but there does seem to be some ambiguity, let's put it that way, as to exactly how that money is going to be spent and what the criteria are going to be. I mean, was there talk in the legislature about that?
If you're speaking, Representative, you might be on mute. Maybe we lost our connection.
I believe you are on mute.
Yeah. Oh, here we go.
There we go.
Hey, can folks hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Momentarily.
Spotty Wi-Fi is the enemy of every live streamer.
Yes.
So
yeah. Again, for folks who just joined us, Representative Eskamani is on the House floor for the special session on gambling today. So that's why we're having issues. And I'll just take this moment to add that if you have questions for us, please pop them into the Facebook chat or on YouTube, you can add your comments there as questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we can in the last 15 minutes or so of this.
All right, well, maybe let's move on with the next topic, which would be Everglades oil drilling. And I'll direct this to Rep. Eskamani if she's there, because she voted yes in committee on a measure that would have prohibited oil drilling in the Everglades protection area. But that bill ultimately, went nowhere. Given the fact that there's such bipartisan support for that bill, as evidenced in the early votes, and the general public's affinity for the Everglades, how come this couldn't get done? Why did this fall by the wayside this session?
We may have to punt on that one too.
All right.
What do you think, Aliki? Yeah.
Were you surprised that it fell by the wayside? Let's put it that way. Aliki.
I'm going to parse that a little. It is unfortunately not terribly surprising. I mean, on the one hand, it's surprising from a logical standpoint. We're spending billions of dollars, many years, lots of mines and resources to restore the Everglades on the one hand. And so on the other hand, you would think that, yes, a bill to protect it from drilling for gas and oil would sail through the legislature.
Right.
I wish I had like a good answer other than to say, unfortunately, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors around issues, and there's a lot of lip service when it comes to our lawmakers know that the majority of Floridians care about the Everglades and that they are willing to invest money in the Everglades. They know that people don't want drilling in the Everglades, but they themselves, unfortunately, don't have the will to stand up against industries that unfortunately want to exploit our natural areas.
I wondered too if with this bill, because there was actually not overwhelming enthusiasm from the environmental community because it didn't go far enough, if that's part of why it languished, because the Everglades protection area is a legally defined area, and it would have only applied to that area. And the biggest threat to oil drilling in the Everglades right now is in Big Cypress, and it wouldn't have protected that area. So had this bill gained momentum, become a bigger news story, it would have been glaringly obvious that it didn't protect against the biggest threat. So
right.
It's conjecture, but I wonder if that was part of it. And we certainly weren't against the bill as filed, but we knew it needed to include Big Cypress. Burnett Oil Company is the company that has applied for permits that would allow them to build oil wells and access roads in Big Cypress National Preserve, which is a horrible idea.
Right.
Really
I mean,
idea.
that's a good point, though, too. I mean, there was not, because of the questions or the caveats that, for example, that we had against this bill, we weren't out there pushing it. We weren't out there backing it. We weren't out there generating, letter writing campaigns, telling people to tell their legislatures that they wanted this. Maybe that was a factor in the fact that it didn't really go anywhere. So, Aliki, let's talk about something that did go somewhere, although maybe didn't go far enough, which is MCORS. It was partially repealed this session. Proposed toll road from Collier to Polk County was scuttled, but other road projects involved in this were not repealed, although there's going to be some different criteria they're going to have to meet, and FDOT's going to be, I guess, in charge of this going forward. But what's your view on this legislation? Did it go far enough?
I think this legislation is something that the environmental and conservation community really should be looking at as a really big win. We may not have, we always talk about winning the war versus winning the battle. Like this war that we're waging against roads in the wrong places is never going to end in 1 year or one session. And so I think the fact that that bill repealed the MCORS program, there is no longer $132 million annually dedicated to going, for example, to that southwestern study area, which would have been awful for panther habitat. It would have been awful for the Everglades. So the fact that that's off the table essentially allows us to kind of regroup and fight another day. I think if we hadn't passed SB 100 this year, and MCORS had survived, I don't know that we would have had as much success next year with MCORS. So it's like you kind of have to you got to take the wins, and you
Yeah,
have to
yeah.
when you can.
Sometimes the glass is half full, right?
I mean, yeah, and it's true that there are some remnants, but when you look at the remnants, one of the remnants is connecting the turnpike to Wildwood. That's a project that was pre MCORS. That's been talked about for a long time. Same thing with upgrades to US 19. So I think we live to fight another day on some of these other road projects.
Okay. Rep. Eskamani, if you can hear me, were you pleased with this legislation? There were a couple bills out there that would have repealed the entirety of this of MCORS, and they didn't really go anywhere. Whereas Senator Harrell's bill sort of sailed through. If you can hear me, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I hope folks can hear me too. I definitely think that, like Aliki said, you have to take the wins that you find, but we need to keep pushing for more. And I think it was a surprise to a lot of lawmakers that this repeal of parts of MCORS actually happened. It's kind of unprecedented that a priority project of past leadership gets repealed. I mean, that was quite surprising, I think, for a lot of us. But it's a good sign that, these special member projects don't always last. And so for the future, when we see these, mass transportation projects that go over, conservation lands, that it's not always the end of the fight when the bill passes. So much respect to all the advocates. I was watching all the MCOR meetings, everybody fighting for Florida's environment, and candidly, so many residents of the directly impacted communities in the armpit of Florida, if you will. None of them wanted this to begin with, and so great advocacy from a bipartisan opposition that I think really helped get us to where we are right now.
Okay, great. Let's stick with Rep. Eskamani on this. I saw a news story this week, according to you, during a legislative debriefing with your constituents, saying that this was a session of culture wars and a session of pretend problems, everything from the prohibiting trans girls from participating in sports to a variety of other things as well. But meanwhile, there's a real problem out there. We've been highlighting it: the blue-green algae bloom on Lake Okeechobee, which is growing, and it's a growing threat. So, given the prospect that we were going to have another huge bloom this summer, why wasn't there more immediacy to the efforts to enact the recommendations of the governor's blue-green algae task force? It's kind of a no-brainer at this point. But basically, were we too busy fighting culture wars to deal with this real problem?
Right. Yeah, 100%. I think it's really frustrating because so many environmental issues don't get the attention they need until the crisis is already happening.
Right.
Look at Piney Point and the gypsum stacks. Look at the depths of manatees. Even right now, we're seeing major concerns around gopher tortoises and sea turtles when it comes to different conservation and removal projects. And so a lot of these issues don't get the attention until the public outcry is there. And it's the same thing even with resiliency projects. I know we mentioned this a little bit earlier before, but we put a lot of money this session towards resiliency, so hardening coastal communities and so forth. I brought up the point more than once that when it comes to environmental justice as a topic, hardening homes that live along the beach are good for those homeowners who are going to most likely have means to even pursue hardening projects. But for farm workers, for construction workers, those who work in labor that's outdoors, the temperature is still going to rise. The storms will still become increasingly worse. And when it comes to property insurance rates, rather, they're going high across the world because of the impacts of climate change. So when it comes to blue-green algae and following the recommendations of the task force, it is a no-brainer. But again, I think because there isn't a major crisis right now around it, that the legislature kind of puts their hands up and thinks it's fine. And you'll see a whole new reaction once the natural disaster happens again.
Yeah, it's almost as if, it would have been good if the bloom had been there and growing when the legislature was in session. Maybe it would have, added a little bit more.
Right. More pressure.
I mean, why was there so little interest in that, Aliki? Why, were you probably weren't surprised, I guess, but why? Why is there so little interest in that?
I mean, I think Representative Eskamani hit the nail on the head. And I want to add actually to one of the dark sides of the resilience funding and the new resilience program that is happening is the fact that the legislature actually chose to gut the Affordable Housing Trust Fund in part to fund continued resilience projects. So to even exacerbate the point Rep. Eskamani made about environmental injustice coming along with this, that's a permanent change that the legislature made, was to shift that housing money away. So I think Rep. Eskamani hit the nail on the head. We spent a lot of time this session talking about things. We legislators spent a lot of time this session talking about things that weren't really problems, and instead really gave up the opportunity. There were bills filed to implement the recommendations of the task force, and they didn't pass. So I think it's a lack of that lack of political will.
I think that's right. I want to stick with you, Aliki, because I noticed that Florida conservation voters had advocated this year for more aggressive water pollution reduction goals and to accelerate the timeline to reach those goals. And it's kind of the same question. You know, we have these periodic, recurring, horrific water quality problems. Why can't we do something simple such as this that might ultimately make things better down the road?
You know, there were a slew of good ideas on the waterfront this legislative session, ideas that we just talked about, and just simply implement the harmful algal bloom task force recommendations. There were bills to just study the amount of lead that is showing up in public school drinking water systems, just so we can get a handle on what the problem is and fix it in the future. There were bills to create a revenue stream by putting a fee on bottled water so that you could then turn around and use that money to keep up this wastewater infrastructure upgrades that we are seeing a little bit of motion on. There were bills to set cleanup standards for these PFAS chemicals. So there's not a lack of ideas, and there's not a lack of people who are over at the Capitol who are really trying, people like Rep. Eskamani actually, who are trying to move these ideas forward. I think the problem, and I think this is an important thing for folks to recognize, is that inside the walls of the Capitol, unfortunately, it's not only policy conversations that are happening. There are a lot of political implications that lawmakers are thinking about, unfortunately, and sometimes they prioritize those, and they prioritize special interests that are whispering into their ears more than they do the policies, unfortunately, and what their constituents are clamoring for.
And Gil, this is Rep. Eskamani, if I could add something to that too. One of the other water issues that were completely ignored, that is water bottling companies. This has been a major crisis, specifically in Ginnie Springs, with companies like Zephyr Hills and Seven Springs Water Co., which are very big special interests across the world, in particular Zephyr Hills. And so the lack of political will to challenge the status quo on the privatization of water is incredibly problematic, and something that everyone cares about. You know, and my district is a swing seat. We swung it in 2018, but the one area where I find common ground with many of my Republican constituents is on the environment, and in particular water and the protection of water. And so, just another topic in this arena that totally got no air.
Right. And I think, again, that's something that our organization has talked about, is the fact that, whatever your political persuasion, if you're dealing with dirty water, if you're dealing with impaired waterways, if you're dealing with these issues, it's going to be a priority for you. It's something that is a priority for a heck of a lot of Floridians, but sometimes it seems like it's less of a priority for our elected officials who represent those Floridians. So, again, disappointing in that respect. This time. Eve, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. I wanted to ask Representative Eskamani a question along those lines. So I know it's hard for Democrats or Republicans to stand up to polluting industries. You have. Why do you feel emboldened to do so, and have you had to pay a price for it?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I feel emboldened to do it because it's the right thing to do. I also have made values-based decisions and how I operate my political campaign where we don't accept money from those special interests. So I don't have a concern, what sugar is going to do in my campaign because I've never relied on them for funds. Now, I'm sure they could spend money against me, and that goes back to your point of what have I paid for it. I mean, in my first campaign, there was over $500,000 spent against me, and I was pretty clear that I wasn't accepting money from sugar or fossil fuel companies and so forth. And you see the backlash play out on the campaign trail. You might see the backlash play out on the movement or lack of movement on your own bills or budget proposals. So there is a risk when you do this, but I find that when you are willing to speak up, it does inspire others to be just as brave. I always remind my colleagues that special interests need you. You don't need them. That should be the dynamic when it comes to serving the people of your district. And so that's where the courage comes from. But whenever I make a statement, there's always a concern in the back of my head of what the ramifications are. But you just can't let that dictate your decision. And to be clear, my door is always open. I mean, every time one of these issues pop up, the special interests want to meet with you. My door's always open, but you ask them tough questions and they can't answer them. So it just further demonstrates why it's so important to be brave when it comes to Florida's environment.
Thanks.
Okay. And then another issue we want to talk about was the water storage north of the lake. I think, Eve, you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I'm curious to hear from both you, Representative, and Aliki on water storage north of the lake, ASR wells. So I'll start by sharing Friends of the Everglades perspective on it. These aquifer storage and recovery wells are not a new concept. They were conceived of back when the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan was first developed. However, there have always been scientific concerns about what they can do to our water supply underground. So water is pumped 1,000 feet underground, and there are concerns about metals interacting with the aquifer, contaminating our water supply. And beyond that, even if all 80 of these are built, which is what this water storage north of the lake bill proposed, and will propose it to accelerate because they still need congressional authorization. Even if all of them are built, they have such a limited capacity for pumping and storing water that they can't fully protect the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee estuaries as they've been sold by some proponents. They can pump, I have it here, 7.7 cubic feet per second. So if all 80 of them are running 24 hours a day, that's about 616 cubic feet per second. Well, when we're getting blasted east and west, it is thousands and thousands of cubic feet per second. And just a cubic foot is like a football, right? Imagine footballs of water flying through at that pace. So it's not Everglades restoration, it's water storage, and it's not even enough water storage to make a difference for the estuaries. That's our perspective. But it passed. So I'll leave it to Aliki and Representative Eskamani to comment on why that was. You want to go first, Aliki?
Sure. I mean, I think that this is one of the dynamics that we always see is a preference for engineered solutions over natural solutions. And I think that ASR north of the lake is a prime example of this. There's just not enough thought, I think, and movement from a policy standpoint on things like making sure that we're protecting lands that are filtering and storing water, making sure that we actually, not to go back to growth management, but if we don't get our growth under control north of the lake between Orlando and Lake Okeechobee, we're going to have more and more impervious surfaces. This problem's only going to get worse. And it's these natural solutions and growth management, they're not silver bullets. They don't solve the night, they're not going to solve the problem overnight. And I think that's part of the false reliance on these ideas like aquifer storage and recovery, is that they're sold as things that can solve things quickly, that there's things that we can just kind of flip a switch and the problem is solved. And as you pointed out, Eve, it's not true. So that's kind of our 2 cents on it. We 100% agree with your analysis of them, not supportive of these, but just that engineered solution. It's like, what's the new shiny object that is presented as the silver bullet, that unfortunately ASR is at this year.
Yeah,
agreed. Representative.
Well, and I'll just add to that. I definitely agree with your perspectives, Eve, and Alika's perspectives, and I'll add to that. My goodness, I think the elephant in the room in all of this is just Florida does not have enough water to keep up with the growth that we're on. And it's funny, on the last days of the legislative session, I was on the lookout for any bills where the title of the bill changed to something like growth management, because usually if you see an amendment change like that, it means that the bill becomes a vehicle for some like major developer or type of driven initiative. So I was on the lookout for any of those changes, because that's when things get snuck in last minute. And I am in Central Florida. We are impacting the water quality south of us, and just like any other industry, like agriculture is impacting the water around them too. And so shiny new objects are going to come and go. Obviously, we need to be pursuing solutions, but I do have a lot of concerns that folks kind of lean on one idea or one concept, when in reality some of the biggest concerns is just the mass growth, and there's not a lot of thought given to how that impacts water quality long term when developers just want to pursue their own bottom line. And that should be the positive concern. And we're having those debates in Orange County, where I am, around efforts to change density rules and things like that at a local level. And so I'll continue to do whatever I can to point out the fact that this massive growth of the state is not sustainable at its current pace and with the current water quality issues that we face.
Yeah, and to Aliki's point, I mean, you point out that the problem itself is multifaceted, right? It has to do with growth and impervious surfaces and what's in the water that's running off these surfaces and getting into the major waterways. So it's this very complex mix of things that's really sort of causing the problem. And any sort of realistic approach to fixing it would also have to be multifaceted. But instead, we go for the quick hit, the quick fix. Again, the silver bullet, to use the term. That's exactly what this is. That's exactly what we think this is. We're going to have this one technological fix that's going to allow us to cut all these corners. We'll make this investment, and this will take care of the problem. And you can pretty much guarantee that anytime something's sold to you in that effect, it's not going to take care of the problem.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So were you disheartened coming out? It's hard not to be disheartened right. in conversations such as these.
I'll point to a silver lining, and Representative Eskamani just made me think of it. Even in Orange County, where growth has been rampant, last year, right, the Rights of Nature referendum was approved, and that's remarkable. Can you talk a little bit about that and what it will do?
Yeah, I'd love to. So, yes, Eve, it's such a good point, because though the special interests dominate the legislative process and folks vote, often in the direction that is not in the best interest of their constituents. And to add, by the way, there were changes made to impact fees this past session, which I know is a little off topic, but the changes to impact fees are very pro-construction, pro-development, and will continue to put Florida on that path of a lot of growth, to the point where even public infrastructure like schools, can't keep up to it. But anyways, to your point about in Orange County for Rights of Nature, so yes, and we actually had two separate environmental referendums on the county ballot in 2020. One of them was Rights of Nature, which basically puts into place the protections for environmental traits. And so, for example, if there's a community concern about development too close to a conservation area or a very important body of water, you can actually pursue litigation on that, right? And a lot of folks have called this radical or called this really extreme, and my response is, well, if corporations are people, which the SCOTUS has said, then I think we should be able to seek justice for a body of water, right? I mean, it's if that's your logic, then how dare you question the logic on this? But anyways, the voters approved it overwhelmingly. Republicans and Democrats and MPAs voted for it overwhelmingly. Now, it is still being debated in court because the the county commission, and the legislature preempted it, and Osceola's, I think, is suing Orange. I mean, the saga continues, but it does speak to the public opinion. I think that's really important for us to remember, is that the public opinion cares about these issues. The public is on our side. We just got to make sure that we're focused on, pursuing the policies that reflect that.
Well put. Thanks. Should we take some audience questions now, Gil?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, I'll ask Allie behind the scenes to pull in any good audience questions we have for you, and we can run through these. This is from Donald Lees. Who decides in the state legislature that a bill is not worthy of a vote, i.e. SB 1522 died and appropriations? How does that happen? I'll give it to Representative Eskamani.
Yeah, I'm happy to take this question. It's a political question, and so I'll be thoughtful in throwing that needle. So when it comes to the legislature, it is leadership that decides what bills are heard and what bills are not heard. So if leadership considers it to be a priority, the bill will be heard. If they don't, then it typically will die. And this speaks to also the influence of special interests, because even if leadership maybe does agree with you on a concept, if there are political donors that don't, that can also impact how the bill gets agendaed. Another point of just like insider baseball, you can look at the committee assignments of a bill. And if there's more than 3 committee assignments, that typically indicates that the leadership doesn't like the bill, and it's going to take a time for the bill to move, if it does move, and it might not even make it to the floor with that many committees. So at the end of the day, leadership in the sense of the speaker and the Senate president are deciding factors, and then committee chairs are also deciding factors.
Good. And just to remind folks, Senate Bill 1522, which was referenced by the questioner, is the Blue-Green Algae Task Force recommendation. So he was wondering why that didn't go anywhere. So I think much of what you said applies to that. And let's be honest, it was filed by Democrats, the Senate bill and the House companion. And there's a strong, majority, not a super majority, but a Republican majority in Tallahassee. And that's okay, but someone put it to me recently, someone who follows public policy very closely in Tallahassee, that public policy overall suffers when either party has too much control, because you don't get into the nuances, you don't adjust policy to make it better as much as you would if there was more balance.
And there may be another aspect to this as well, which is the fact that while the algae has been a very acute problem for those who live along in the area of the St. Lucie or the Caloosahatchee, if you live up in the Panhandle, if you live somewhere else in Florida and you haven't had to experience the issues with the blue-green algae, it may not seem as real to you. It may not seem as real to your constituents. Your constituents may, in fact, be saying, "Well, we've got other concerns," and maybe that carries weight or carries water until the next time the New York Times has pictures of algae-clogged marinas in Stuart, Florida, gracing its front page, or international media is picking up stories about massive fish kills, over on Sanibel Island, something along those lines. So, a lot of it could, some of it could be anyway, well, this isn't a problem for me and my constituents until it becomes one.
Right. And we saw that in 2018 for sure. Do we have more questions, Allie?
Can I just add one real quick thing?
Sure.
Just because, and not to belabor the point, but part of the reason why we work on democracy issues, things like redistricting, things like term limits, like those sort of basic architecture of our democracy, is because of exactly what you said, Eve. And that is, you can't make good policy if you don't have a functioning and honestly inclusive democracy. And right now we don't have that in Florida. So I just want to put a plug in for folks who are watching today. Redistricting is going to start happening, and it doesn't sound like, from an environmental standpoint, that would be anywhere in our lane, but it very much is in our lane. And folks, I would urge them to plug in and get involved. So sorry, next question.
That's good. I mean, what's the best way to do that in your opinion?
Well, obviously, fcvoters.org, we're engaging in redistricting, and I'm happy to share information with you and keep you all in the loop. But folks can check there. As you said, when you have gerrymandered districts, there's an imbalance there's a bigger dynamic at play, where in Florida right now, the legislature isn't actually composed or reflected in a way that our communities are. And so when you have that mismatch of what does Florida look like and what does the legislature look like, part of the reason we have that is because of gerrymandering and how the actual districts are drawn, so that they're drawn in a way that historically they've, in the last two decades, they've been drawn in a way so that lawmakers are choosing their voters as opposed to the other way around. It's not supposed to be that way. Voters are supposed to choose their lawmakers. Right. So, yeah.
And there has been legal action over that. So yeah,
yes.
Important to watch the next redistricting process. Okay, we'll take that question now, Allie, if you can pop it back up. Kevin McAllister asks, critical issues of concern revolve around the Clean Water Act. I think he's referring to not the Clean Waterways Act. How has the December 2020 EPA permitting delegation to FDEP impacted regulatory protections, i.e. water quality standards, jurisdictional wetlands? And thank you for the great work that you do. Thanks, Kevin. So he's talking about the 404 permitting assumption that transferred wetland permitting from EPA to state DEP. Representative Eskamani, do you have a take on that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think for a lot of us, it's very concerning, especially with just the political environment of now EPA being with the Biden administration, which the Biden administration has expressed more support for environmental protection. I mean, in particular, just the appointments being made at a federal level compared to the past administration are much more promising. And so I think there has been a concern with oversight leaving the new White House to a state level. But I've also heard, the commentary on the opposing side that the state is more close to the issue. But I'm really curious what our environmental groups think, because I just feel like the history of FDEP before I ran for office, for me anyways, was always kind of seen as a rubber stamp for development, and really wasn't seen as the best oversight arm. I don't know, Aliki, maybe that's changed from where you are, but yeah. So I love to hear what the environmental groups think, but that's kind of where I've kind of stood on the issue since that shift took place.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the wetlands delegation issue was one of those moments where the environmental community in Florida was fairly united. Most organizations, I can't actually think of one organization that supported that delegation. I know there might be one or two. I just
we didn't.
Yeah. No, we did not. We definitely were very much opposed to it. And fundamentally, it's completely removing a layer of protection for wetlands. 30 years ago, when the Clean Water Act was first passed, there was this idea that we should have a no net loss of wetlands, that we should keep them steady, and we are having serious loss of wetlands in Florida. One thing I do want to highlight, this is actually in litigation. And so it's not a done deal whether or not Florida will receive authority to administer the 404 wetlands program. A number of national environmental organizations sued, and in order to prevent the United States Environmental Protection Agency from actually finalizing that rule. The rule, folks might remember, was rammed through at the very tail end of the last the Trump administration. So fingers crossed that they'll win, and the authority won't be transferred.
Yeah. And while it was rammed through at the end of the Trump administration, it actually was proposed when Rick Scott was governor, and it was billed as a more efficient method. And I think when we're talking about efficiency of paving over wetlands, filling wetlands, dredging and filling wetlands,
right? Because there's a very practical aspect to all this. If DEP is going to all of a sudden have the authority to do this, well, did DEP hire extra people to handle the workload? Right. Are they expanding their? Nope. No. So how and that the development community has been so enthusiastic about this should say a lot about what's really going on. That sort of thing. So again, you're going to hand a state agency this tremendous responsibility. Obviously they're going to have to beef up to handle it, right? They're going to have the resources to meet the demand. If they don't, how in the world are they going to give the scrutiny to any of these permits?
Yeah, and there's a very real test case right now with the Burnett Oil Company, which is seeking to drill in Big Cypress, and they had to apply for these very permits, and it's now in the state's hands. So how will that play out? How will the lawsuit play out? We'll be watching.
Right.
Do we have more questions, Allie? From John Heim, how do regular activists help stop the discharges? Protest? So he's talking about Lake Okeechobee discharges. We've been engaged with the Army Corps of Engineers. Gil's been very engaged too on the new Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, which we hope will reduce the discharges. So I don't know, Aliki, you engage with a lot of folks on the ground. I know you're not here on the St. Lucie or Caloosahatchee estuaries, but what do you think can be effective?
I mean, we always come at it from a standpoint of, I mean, in terms of like each individual discharge, I mean, Eve, you all are much more expert. As I see it, as I understand it, it's a complicated question of, do you discharge the water to the coast? Do you keep it in the lake? And does that destroy the lake? And so there's this balancing act that needs to happen. To me, it seems like the answer to the discharges is some of the policies we were talking about earlier, and some of the things that I'm seeing in the chat is making sure that, you know, when it comes to the STAs, when it comes to the infrastructure that's in the glades, that we're actually capturing that water. So I'd love to hear actually what y'all think about like the reservoir, for example. I mean, if we need more reservoirs, if we need more water conservation areas, like what are the things that we need? And the reason, I know that's not like a what can people do to stop the discharges, but like getting behind those solutions, advocating for those solutions, holding lawmakers accountable to prioritizing the solutions that are actually going to work, as opposed to having this every year, you know, trying to sort of navigate this awful balance that we're having to try to do.
Yeah, I want to hear from Gil, who just wrote a really great op-ed about this topic, the discharges and DeSantis's pledges recently. But I'll just say very briefly, and then we should have a whole other hour-long conversation about the reservoir and STAs.
Yeah.
But yes, we need more STAs, stormwater treatment areas south of Lake Okeechobee, so that we can send more water south and clean it to meet federal water quality standards before it is sent to the Everglades. And yes, we are concerned about the shrunken down size of the EAA reservoir, the depth of it. So if anyone wants more information about that, we're happy to direct you to some concerns on our website. So, but I wanted to give Gil a minute to talk about what
right now, the federal government, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, is in the process of rewriting. I use the term playbook, the playbook for how it manages Lake O. It's the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual. And there are quite a few stakeholders who have been involved in that process, who have been following that process extremely closely. We are one of them. We've been following that process very, very closely. And, you know, it's at the sort of the highest level, at the federal level, this is going to influence what happens in the future. The ultimate plan, the playbook that the Army Corps of Engineers comes up with is going to roll. That's like the die that's going to be cast, right? Mm-hmm. And we, you know, those of us on the East Coast, those of us, you know, in the Caloosahatchee estuary, are going to have to live with that as well. Now, the Governor DeSantis came out last week urging the Army Corps of Engineers to take steps, you know, to keep the lake lower, for example, in the winter. So that we don't get into a situation like we are now, when the lake's still at 13.5 feet, you know, 2.5 feet higher than where it was a year ago, and the wet season's looming. So the governor, in many respects, has been very good in terms of his rhetoric, in terms of what he's been saying, and the political pressure that he's been putting on, for example, the Army Corps of Engineers to, quote unquote, do the right thing when it comes to this new playbook. We, however, have suggested there's things like he could do now. And for example, with the bloom that's out there on the lake, we've been part of a group of organizations that have asked him to declare a state of emergency now. And you know, again, there are things that can be done now to maybe get ahead of the problem we almost are certainly going to have this summer. I mean, you know, keep your fingers crossed and your toes crossed as well. But, you know, it looks as if we're probably going to have discharges this summer. And if we do have discharges this summer, there's so much algae in the lake, the potential for it to be, you know, horrendous exists. And so, again, you know, we've advocated, you know, said when it comes to the governor, we've said, you know, the rhetoric is great, you know, and he really has, you know, pushed for a lot of things that we think can make a difference. But there is more that can be done. There's more that can be done at the state level. There's more that can be done at the federal level. And for the average citizen following this. I would say stay tuned to the organization and stakeholders that are following this rewrite of the playbook very closely, because there's some stuff that comes up, where some of the vested interests try to pull rank, so to speak, and try to get their interests taken care of. And what does that mean to your interests? It's tough stuff. It's a lot of graphs and numbers and models but bottom line, this is what's going to happen. This is what the playbook is going to be, and it's going to affect your life. So it helps to be engaged with what's going on. It helps to pay attention to it. Where there are letter writing campaigns, maybe organized by organizations like Florida Conservation Voters or Friends of the Everglades, it might behoove you to get involved in that, because at the end of the day, your voice counts. Your concerns, should you choose to air them, will be noted. They may not be heeded, but they will be noted. And I think if people stay involved and stay informed, that's the best path to actually making a difference.
That's the name of the game. Thanks, Gil. So we have just a couple minutes left, and I'd like to give Representative Eskamani the final word. Thank you for joining us when you're juggling potential House floor votes today. Just reflecting back on this past legislative session and looking ahead to the next one, what are you thinking about environmental issues, particularly water?
Well, thank you again so much for the invitation. I'm sorry that I'm running in and out to do votes on the floor on the Gambling Compact, but it's been such a joy to join you all today. And, when it comes to looking at the future, I think advocates need to continue to hold elected officials accountable to these water issues. Don't be afraid of the power of special interest, because you are powerful in your own voice. And lawmakers cannot reject the perspective of constituents without feeling at least the pressure that constituents will remind them who they were elected to serve. So when it comes to issues that I want to focus on, we need to see the Blue-Green Algae Task Force recommendations be passed. I think that has to be number one of our goals. We need to do something about the power of private water bottling. First of all, just plastics in general is a problem, and the fact that we allow corporations to pump water with very little cost that the state receives. The private landowner receives money, but not the state, is something we should all be concerned about. And of course, just looking at the expansion of growth policies without thinking of its impact on our environment, without thinking about also the changing climate that also impacts our water quality. These are all the topics that are on my mind going into next session. And I definitely look forward to continuing the conversation with our coalition partners and encourage everyone to stay involved throughout the summer and into the redistricting process, because yes, like Aliki said, redistricting might not feel like an environmental issue, but at the end of the day, it will impact who you're able to actually get into office to support you and your initiatives.
Thank you, Representative. If anyone wants to read more about the session, you can go to everglades.org. We have our full post-session legislative report there. You can sign up for our emails. And I just want to thank those of you who support us. We are able to offer these live stream events for free because of your support. And thanks to Gil, Aliki, and Representative Eskamani for joining us today. It's very valuable. To be continued.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.